Hi team, in this video we're going to look at the law of supply and supply side factors. So you're going to be able to outline what the law of supply is and the theory of the law of supply, and we're going to look at the profit motive for producers in that. We're going to illustrate the supply curve, so similar to the demand curve, but obviously we're looking at the supply side implications. And then we're going to go through all these factors that lead to shifts in our supply curve. So to get started, this is the law of supply. So simply put, as the price increases, the quantity supplied increases. So I want you to think about that for a moment. If you have a look at the direction of the supply curve, it's upward sloping, which means that as we see an increase in price along our y-axis, we're going to see an increase in the quantity supplied. Now have a think, why would that be the case? You're a producer, the price for your product increases, you're obviously going to look to increase supply because ultimately you want to maximize profits. Okay, so similar to the demand curve, we're dealing with movements along the supply curve. So again, we can refer to movements along the supply curve as either the contraction or the expansion. And if it's a contraction, then it suggests that supply is contracting, it's decreasing. And so for that to happen, in order for the supply to decrease, we need to be traveling along towards the left of the supply curve. Similarly, the expansion is the other way. So movement right along the curve caused by an increase in price. So again, just thinking, well, what's a contraction, what's an expansion? In terms of demand and supply, they are similar in the sense that if the quantity is increasing, then we're dealing with an expansion. And if the quantity is decreasing, we're dealing with a contraction, okay? And so hopefully this illustrates that. So just line this up against demand and make sure you've got your head around what's a contraction and expansion along the demand curve and what's a contraction and expansion along the supply curve. They are similar in a sense, but students do mix them up from time to time. Okay, so having a look at this one for me, an increase in the price of coffee would result in an expansion along the supply curve for coffee beans because, once again, I'm going to read all four answers. I want to make sure I've got my head around them before I pick one. So the wages of the coffee farmers have decreased. Doesn't sound right. Remember, if we're dealing with a contraction or an expansion or a movement, it can only be because of changes in price. So I'm not going to strike that one off immediately, but I'm going to keep going. So the quantity demanded will fall as the price increases. Keep going. The price of fertilizer, which is needed to grow the coffee, has increased. No. And the profitability associated with coffee production has increased. Now, I'm going to link the word profitability through to price. And if price has gone up, well, then we know that there needs to be an expansion along the supply curve. So the answer is D. A and B, I mean, if we really unpacked it, potentially, but the word profitability is directly linked to prices. So go for the most obvious answer. Okay, once again, and I've already said this, movement versus shift. So the movement is only the result of a change in the price, whereas a shift of the curve is obviously due to a change in any other factor. So we're going to look at those factors that were listed at the start. In both situations, the supply for the good or service will change, but the reasons for the change are different. So take that mentality from shifts and movements along the demand curve. So we know that a movement along the demand curve is only due to a change in price, and a shift in the demand curve is due to a change of, we had I think 7 or 8 factors. This is the same thing, okay? So take that thinking and apply it directly to the supply curve, and we'll put it all together in the next set of slides. Okay, so the factors, the first one that can cause a shift is the cost of production. So the cost of production is the direct or indirect cost businesses face from manufacturing a product or producing a service. So a bit of a definition for you there. Assume you bake bread and the cost of wheat increases because of something, whatever. If the cost of the wheat goes up, well, then there is your increase in the cost of production. So if you are a baker, you will no longer be able to produce as much bread because one of the primary ingredients in the production of your good or service has gone up. So similarly, we can look at, and this is just some examples obviously, if electricity increases, cost of production goes up. If the price of petrol increases, cost goes up. If the cost of raw materials increases, then cost goes up. And all of these are going to lead to a decrease in supply. Likewise, go the other way. If there's suddenly a decrease in the price of petrol, which we do observe from time to time, then that's great. If I need petrol in the production process, then hopefully I'm going to see a reduction in my production costs, and that's going to lead to an increase in supply. Okay, so here we are looking at a graph of petrol prices relative to the Russian-Ukraine war, and you can see that of late, since all that's kicked off, the price of oil's obviously increased. So this suggests that there would be an increase in the cost of production for the majority of producers, and that's going to lead to a decrease in the supply of goods and services, which we have seen. Okay. Factor number 2 is the number of suppliers. So imagine a product suddenly becomes more profitable. So the price of a particular good or service increases. A lot of producers are going to go and have a look in that market and make a decision as to whether or not it's worth them entering that market. And that's usually what happens, because if there's an increase for the demand for a product, not only will the existing producers increase output, we're going to see a whole lot of new producers enter that space. So a change in the number of sellers in an industry changes the quantity available at each price point. So basically, increase in suppliers leads to a shift to the right, and a reduction in the number of sellers goes the other way. It leads to a shift to the left. So I want to use streaming services as an example. So assume the market for streaming services in Australia, if you wind it back maybe 5 or 6 years ago, there really weren't that many players in this market. We obviously had Foxtel forever and a day, and then Netflix was the first big one that I can remember that really hit hard. But since then, we've got a whole bunch of other streaming services that have since entered the market. And so if you imagine the market for streaming services, that supply curve has slowly shifted further and further to the right. Now, I know it's not perfect. I know that they're all quite different in terms of what they offer, but at the end of the day, that market is expanding. And the other piece there is we have seen changes in prices as well. So which one of the following factors is likely to result in a shift of the supply curve for fresh vegetable juices to the right? There's an increase in interest rates, or actually, before we get going, if there is an increase or a shift to the supply curve to the right, what does that suggest about supply? Is supply increasing or decreasing? So if you need to sort of nut that one out, grab a pen and paper and just draw it down, and then shift that supply curve to the right so you can see it, and you'll see that that leads to obviously an increase. So we're looking for one that leads to an increase in supply. So if there's an increase in interest rates, well, that means it's going to be more expensive to produce, which would decrease the cost of production. So it can't be A. There's an increase in the price of veggies. Now, this one is about price. Price leads to movement. We're not dealing with a movement, we're dealing with a shift. So it can't be B. An increase in the wages paid to employees. Again, that should increase the cost of production, not decrease it. So that leads to a shift to the left, so not it. And then an increase in the profitability for juice-making firms. Now, I've planted this one here because if there's an increase in the profitability for juice-making firms, right, and I'm a producer, but I'm not currently making juices, I might look at the market for juice making and go, hang on, there's an opportunity here. I'm going to take my scarce resources, move them away from what I'm currently doing and put them into this market. And ultimately that increases the number of suppliers, and that will shift my supply curve to the right. I hope that makes sense. Cool. Number 3 is technological change. So innovation in technology usually allows for scarce resources to be used more efficiently. So think of any kind of tech, really. I mean, even this with the laptop, and, you know, I'm not in the room right now and you guys are learning, like there's an increase in technology use, and that's allowed for an increase in efficiency. So I'll get you to watch this one in your own time, but basically it's this really cool machine that has a big umbrella that wraps across the base of an almond tree, and then this machine shakes the almond tree and all the almonds fall off the tree really, really quickly. Compare that to when you needed manual labour to physically pick every single almond off the tree. You can see that this production process has become way more efficient, and as a result that's going to lead to a decrease in costs, and that's going to shift the curve to the right. Okay, so worth watching. And then finally, actually not finally, I think there's one more after this, but number 4 is productivity growth. Now, productivity is going to be a huge thing that we look at in economics. So please make sure you learn the definition. Please make sure it makes sense to you. And if it doesn't, let's have a chat. So productivity refers to the amount of output that you can achieve for your given level of input. Okay. So we have our land, labor, capital, and enterprise. I know this has labor and capital, but the other two are in there as well. We use them as their inputs. We put them all together and it spits out outputs. Now, we could be really awesome at it, use our products really, our inputs really carefully to produce lots of output, but we could also be really inefficient, right? We might not use our land, labor, capital, and enterprise to the best of its ability. We waste some of it spoils, who knows? But that would suggest that output's not going to be maximized. So again, you're a producer. You're always going to seek to maximize productivity, all right? Because you ultimately want to get as much output as you possibly can with the resources that you've got. And if you can do that, then you actually manage to reduce the cost per unit that you produce. Everything you produce is slightly cheaper per unit because you haven't used as much stuff to make it. I wanted to show you this graph. So this graph is from the Reserve Bank of Australia, and it maps productivity over time. It's not a great story for Australia. you can see from 95, 96 through till 2021 that both multi-factor productivity and labour productivity have gone down. Now, labour productivity is exclusively productivity related to labour, obviously, and multi-factor productivity is the combination of land, labour, capital, and enterprise all together. So we like to separate it because labour's special. Labour's special in the sense that we want to make sure that our human resources, who are obviously very variable, right? Like humans are fickle, they're different day to day. You know, you might have days where you're really, really productive and days where you're not. Just because they're, I suppose, so uncontrollable, we want to look at labour separately. Now, it's not as though productivity's gone backwards over time. If you have a look, the rate is still positive. So I'm going to focus on the black line, the straight black line, and you can see that the trend over time shows a decrease in the rate of increase. So in 1995, labour productivity was sitting at around, just under 3% growth per annum. So we're achieving 3% more with our labour productivity for that year. And then if we wind it or go all the way to 2021, we see that number fall actually to below 1%. So we're still seeing an increase in productivity over time, but instead of growing at 3% per annum, we're seeing a growth of 1% per annum. So this should really, serve as a red flag for economists, because over time, we're finding that we're actually not as productive as we used to be. And the bad part there is, what happens if we cross zero? What happens if we go backwards? Okay, and ultimately, all of this is going to lead to a shift to the left of the supply curve, because we are not as productive as we once were. This is the last one. So factor number 5, climatic conditions. So the final factor that you need to know in terms of how it impacts the supply curve relates to climatic factors. So I'm talking about the weather, but it can also include other sort of macro trends that we don't have control over. So what I mean by that is the pandemic is a really good example. World wars, what else? Conflict, those kinds of things that are going to come in and pretty much muck up your economy, okay? So the first few, drought, climate change, floods, they're obviously all related to weather conditions. You can see on the far right, we're dealing with a drought. A drought means no water. No water means you're going to struggle to grow. If you're unable to grow, you're going to see a shift to the left of the supply curve because there's a decrease in supply. And terrorism is another one, right? So if you have a big terrorist event in your economy, well, then that could potentially make it difficult for you to produce, and that would then lead to a reduction in supply. Similar with the pandemic, overnight we all had to sit at home and we weren't allowed to go to work in the traditional sense. That led to a huge decrease in the supply of goods and services as well. So I've put this one here as a little bit of an Easter egg for you. A movement along the supply curve for broccoli is most likely to have been caused by. Now notice the use of the word movement. Not dealing with a shift, dealing with a movement. What causes a movement? It can only be a change in price. So I'm looking for something that changes the price that impacts the supply curve. So a shortage of skilled farm workers. That sounds like a factor to me. A decrease in the price of fertilizer. Now that, bang, it's got to be B, right? We're dealing with price if we're dealing with movements, so it has to be B, but I'll keep reading. A decrease in personal income tax rates, so that's a demand side factor. And the removal of the excise tax on petrol used by farmers. Now, we'll get into excise tax later, but ultimately, if the government reduces tax, it makes the petrol more affordable. We know that petrol is an input, so that would lead to a decrease in the cost of production and shift the curve. So it doesn't answer the question. So the answer needs to be B. And I've put this here because I want to try and encourage you to piece together an acronym to help you remember the factors. So you will get asked questions like, suggest a supply side factor that leads to X. And you'll need to go, oh, hang on a second, I'm dealing with only a supply side factor. And I want you to do this because often students will talk about disposable income or changes in interest rates and start sort of going on about some kind of demand side factor, even though the question's related to supply. So STP, double C. So stop, CC. All right, stop, CC. Get that in your memory. If you can come up with something better, that's fine, but this is the one I'm going to go with. So S, suppliers, T for tech, P for productivity, C for cost of production, and the other C is for climate conditions or climatic conditions. And that's it, guys. Awesome. Thank you.